The metal floor was cold against Daeho's face when he woke up. His head felt heavy and his throat burned with a pain he remembered too well. The last thing he could recall was the flash of alien weapons cutting through the smoke above Seoul, the screams of his fellow soldiers, the moment when shrapnel tore through his vocal cords and stole his voice forever. Now he was somewhere else entirely. Daeho pushed himself up slowly and looked around. He was in a large room with walls made of smooth gray metal. The ceiling glowed with a soft blue light that reminded him of deep ocean water. Around him, dozens of other humans sat or lay on the floor. Some were crying. Others stared at nothing with empty eyes. A few paced back and forth like caged animals. He recognized some faces from the final battle. There was Min-ho, a young soldier, who used to joke about his mother's cooking. The man looked much older now, his uniform torn and dirty. Near the far wall sat Hye-jin, a medic who had saved countless lives during the invasion. She was holding her head in her hands. Daeho tried to speak, to ask where they were, but only a rough whisper came out. The sound hurt his damaged throat. He touched his neck gently and felt the bandages there. Someone had treated his wounds, but they had not been able to give him back his voice. The room suddenly filled with a low humming sound. A section of the wall slid open and 3 tall figures walked in. Daeho had never seen anything like them before. They were taller than humans, with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer under the strange light. Their heads were longer than human heads, and their eyes were large and completely black. They wore dark uniforms that looked like they were made of liquid metal. One of the aliens stepped forward. When it moved, Daeho noticed something odd. The creature did not make any sound with its mouth, but the other 2 aliens seemed to understand what it wanted. They moved to different positions around the room as if they had received orders. The lead alien looked at the human prisoners with what might have been disgust. Its black eyes moved from person to person, studying them like insects in a jar. When those eyes reached Daeho, he forced himself to look back. He had learned in military training never to show fear to an enemy. The alien stared at him for a long moment. Daeho noticed that tiny lights flickered under the creature's skin near its temples. The other 2 aliens also had these lights, and they seemed to pulse in patterns. Some kind of communication system, Daeho realized. They were talking to each other without making any sound. Min-ho suddenly jumped to his feet and started shouting, "Let us go. We are prisoners of war. You have to treat us according to the Geneva Convention." The lead alien turned its attention to Min-ho. One of the other aliens moved closer to the young soldier. Without warning, it raised a device that looked like a silver stick and pointed it at Min-ho. A blue beam shot out and hit the soldier in the chest. Min-ho screamed and fell to the floor, his body shaking. "Stop!" Hye-jin cried out and ran toward Min-ho. The alien with the weapon turned toward her, but the lead alien raised its hand. The weapon lowered. Hye-jin knelt beside Min-ho and checked his pulse. "He's alive," she said to the other prisoners. But barely. The lead alien made a gesture with one long finger. The lights under its skin pulsed faster. The other 2 aliens nodded and began moving through the prisoners, pointing devices at each person. Blue beams scanned the humans from head to toe. When they reached Daeho, he felt a strange tingling sensation as the beam passed over him. The Kamuri alien scanning him paused. It looked at its device, then at Daeho's throat where the bandages were visible. The creature made a soft clicking sound and showed the device to the lead alien. More lights flickered under their skin as they communicated. The lead alien approached Daeho. It leaned down and examined his throat more closely. Daeho could smell something like ozone and metal coming from the creature. The alien straightened up and made another gesture. The lights under its skin pulsed in a different pattern. One of the other aliens left the room and returned a few minutes later with a 4th creature. This one was smaller and wore a different uniform. It carried what looked like a medical scanner. The new alien ran the scanner over Daeho's throat, then showed the results to the lead alien. More silent communication passed between them. Then, the lead alien did something that surprised Daeho. It pointed at him and made a dismissive wave with its hand. The meaning was clear even without words. Broken, useless, Not worth their time. The aliens finished their scanning and left the room. The wall sealed shut behind them with a soft hiss. The prisoners were alone again. What did they want? Whispered an older man named Jong-Soo. They were cataloging us, said Hye-jin. She was still kneeling beside Min-ho, who was breathing, but unconscious. Like we were products in a warehouse. They think we're animals, said another prisoner bitterly. Dae-ho said nothing because he could not. But he had been watching carefully during the entire encounter. He had noticed things that the others missed. The way the aliens positioned themselves around the room followed a specific pattern. The lead alien always stayed near the door while the others worked. When they communicated with their flashing lights, certain patterns seemed to mean different things. One pattern appeared to be a question. Another seemed to be agreement. Most importantly, he had seen something in the lead alien's eyes when it looked at him. The creature had written him off as damaged goods. That was exactly what Dae-ho wanted. In his years as a communications specialist with the Korean military, he had learned that the best intelligence came from being underestimated. When the enemy thought you were harmless, they stopped watching you carefully. They made mistakes. These aliens had made their first mistake. They thought that because he could not speak, he could not communicate. They thought that because his voice was broken, his mind was broken too. They were wrong. Dae-ho settled back against the wall and continued to watch. He studied the way the other prisoners moved and reacted. He memorized the layout of the room and the timing of the humming, sounds that seemed to come from the walls. He watched the patterns of light that came and went from the ceiling. He could not speak, but he could still see. He could still think. He could still learn, and he could still fight back, even if the aliens would never hear him coming. 3 days had passed since Dae-ho first woke up in the alien prison. He had learned to count time by watching the blue lights in the ceiling grow brighter and dimmer in regular cycles. The aliens fed the prisoners twice each cycle through slots that opened in the walls. The food looked like gray paste but tasted like nothing at all. During those 3 days, Dae-ho had been watching everything. He watched how the guards moved when they came to check on the prisoners. He watched how the other humans reacted to different situations. Most importantly, he watched the aliens themselves. The creatures were called Velerans. He had learned by listening to the guards talk among themselves in their own language. They used their mouth sounds only when their light communication system was not working properly. Their real language was the flashing patterns under their skin. Dae-ho had started to recognize some of these patterns. A quick double flash meant yes or agreement. A long, steady glow meant wait or hold position. A rapid series of flashes that looked like Morse code seemed to be used for giving orders. On the morning of the 4th day, something went wrong with the ship. It started with a low vibration that Dae-ho felt through the metal floor. Then the blue lights in the ceiling began to flicker in an unsteady way. Some of the human prisoners looked around nervously, but most did not notice the change. They were too lost in their own fear and sadness. Dae-ho sat up straighter and paid attention. The vibration was getting stronger. Through the walls he could hear sounds that reminded him of machinery breaking down, metal groaning under stress, the hiss of air escaping from somewhere it should not be escaping from. Then the lights under the alien's skin stopped working. The first sign of trouble came when 2 guards entered the prison room for their regular check. Dae-ho watched as they tried to communicate with each other using their usual light signals. But the lights flickered weakly and then went out completely. The guards looked at each other with what might have been panic in their large black eyes. One guard tried to speak, aloud in the Valyrian language. The sounds were harsh and clicking like insects talking. The other guard answered back, but they seemed to be having trouble understanding each other. They were so used to their silent light language that speaking with sounds felt strange and difficult. More guards arrived. Soon there were 6 aliens in the prison room, all trying to talk to each other with their voices instead of their lights. They sounded confused and frightened. Some of them kept touching the spots on their temples, where the lights should have been flashing. The ship shook harder. Emergency lights began flashing red along the walls. An alarm started making a loud wailing sound that hurt everyone's ears. "What's happening?" asked Hye-jin, the medic. She was sitting near Dae-ho and had noticed him watching the guards carefully. Dae-ho could not answer with words, but he held up one finger to tell her to wait and keep watching. He pointed to the guards and then to his own throat. Then he shook his head. The message was clear. The aliens could not communicate properly anymore. The lead guard was a tall alien that Daeho had seen before. It was trying to give orders to the other guards, but they were not understanding correctly. When it pointed toward the door and made clicking sounds, 2 guards went toward the door while 1 went toward the opposite wall. When it made angry, clicking sounds and pointed again, the guards looked even more confused. That was when Daeho noticed Bo-Ra. She was sitting in the corner of the room with her arms wrapped around her knees. Before the invasion, Bo-Ra had been an engineer who worked on subway systems in Seoul. She was small and quiet, but Daeho knew she was very smart. During the battle for the city, she had helped repair damaged communication equipment under enemy fire. Bo-Ra was watching the guards too. Her eyes were moving from one alien to another, and Daeho could see her mind working. She understood that something was wrong with their communication system. The ship shook again, more violently this time. Some of the human prisoners cried out, in fear. One of the aliens fell down and had trouble getting back up. The emergency lights flashed faster. Daeho made a decision that would change everything. He stood up slowly and walked toward Bo-Ra. The guards noticed him moving, but they were too busy trying to talk to each other to stop him. When he reached Bo-Ra, Daeho sat down facing her. He pointed to himself, then to her, then to the confused guards. Bo-Ra looked at him with questions in her eyes. Daeho nodded and began to use his hands. First, he held up both hands with his fingers spread wide. Then he brought his hands together and made them shake. The message was simple. The ship was having problems. Bo-Ra understood immediately. She nodded. Next, Daeho pointed to the guards and touched his own temple where their lights should be flashing. Then he shook his head and covered his eyes. Their communication system was broken and they could not see what to do. Bo-Ra's eyes grew wider. She was beginning to understand what Daeho was thinking. Daeho looked around the room until he found what he needed. Near one wall there was a small piece of metal that had fallen from somewhere. He picked it up and began scratching marks on the floor. Simple drawings that showed the shape of the room and the positions of the guards. Then he drew arrows showing how the guards were moving in the wrong directions. He pointed to the real guards and then to his drawings. Bo-Ra leaned closer to see what he was showing her. The ship shook again. This time sparks flew from one of the wall panels. The smell of burning electronics filled the air. The guards were making more frantic clicking sounds, but they still could not coordinate their actions. Daeho continued his drawings. He showed Bo-Ra how the guards should be positioning themselves around the room, how they should be working together instead of getting in each other's way. His years of military training had taught him about small unit tactics and coordination. Bo-Ra watched his hands as he drew. Slowly, she began to nod. She understood what he was trying to tell her. The aliens were lost without their technology. They had forgotten how to work together using simple methods. But Bo-Ra was an engineer. She knew about systems and how they worked. And Daeho was a communications expert who understood coordination and teamwork. Between the two of them, they might be able to help. Bo-Ra pointed to the wall panel that was sparking. She made gestures, with her hands to show electricity flowing. Then she pointed to herself and nodded. She could fix the electrical problem. Daeho smiled for the first time since becoming a prisoner. He pointed to the guards and made organizing gestures with his hands. He could help them coordinate their actions. The question was, would the aliens accept help from the humans they had written off as primitive and useless? Another explosion somewhere in the ship made the decision urgent. The emergency lights were flashing so fast now that they looked almost solid red. The air was getting harder to breathe. Daeho stood up and walked toward the lead guard. The alien saw him coming and made threatening sounds, but Daeho kept his hands visible and moved slowly. When he reached the guard, he pointed to the sparking wall panel and then to Bo-Ra. The guard looked confused. Daeho tried again. He pointed to Bo-Ra, then made gestures like someone working with tools. He pointed to the broken panel and made a gesture like something being fixed. The lead guard's black eyes moved from Daeho to Bo-Ra to the sparking panel. For a moment, Daeho thought the alien would refuse. Then the ship shook so hard that everyone fell down, and the lights went out completely. In the darkness, Daeho heard the lead guard make a decision. It clicked out what sounded like an order. When the emergency lights came back on, the guard was pointing at Bo-Ra, and then at the broken panel. Bo-Ra looked at Daeho. He nodded and made encouraging gestures. She took a deep breath and stood up. The silent human and the quiet engineer were about to show an advanced alien species something they had forgotten, that sometimes the best communication happens without any words at all. Bo-Ra worked on the sparking wall panel while Daeho watched the guards. Her small hands moved quickly and carefully as she pulled out damaged wires and reconnected them in different patterns. She had found tools scattered on the floor from when the ship shook, and she used them like a surgeon uses medical instruments. The lead guard stood behind her, making nervous clicking sounds. The other guards gathered around, but they were still having trouble talking to each other with their voices. They kept reaching for their temples where the light communicators should have been working. Daeho could see the problem clearly. The aliens were like people who had worn glasses their whole lives and suddenly could not see. They had the same eyes as before, but they had forgotten how to use them without help. He moved closer to the group of guards and began making slow, careful gestures. He pointed to one guard, then to a position near the door. He pointed to another guard and showed a different position. The guards looked at him with confusion in their black eyes. The lead guard made sharp clicking sounds that were probably meant to tell Daeho to go away. But then the ship shook again, and more sparks flew from the walls. The alien looked around at its confused crew and seemed to realize it had no choice. It clicked out what sounded like a question to the other guards. They clicked back with what might have been agreement. The lead guard looked at Daeho and made a gesture that clearly meant, "Show us." Daeho nodded. He had been studying their formations for days, and he could see how they should be working together. He walked to the center of the room and began directing them like a conductor leading an orchestra. He pointed to the first guard, and then to the door. The guard moved there. He pointed to the second guard and indicated a spot where it could watch both the prisoners and the corridor outside. The guard moved to that position. One by one, he positioned all 6 guards in a formation that made sense. When he was finished, the guards were standing in a pattern that allowed them to see everything in the room and communicate with each other, using simple hand signals and eye contact. For the first time since their lights stopped working, they looked organized and calm. The lead guard stared at Daeho with something that might have been respect growing in its dark eyes. Bo-Ra finished her work on the wall panel. The sparks stopped, and some of the regular lighting came back on. She wiped sweat from her forehead and gave Daeho a small smile. "The power system is stable now," she said quietly. "But their communication network will take much longer to fix." The ship stopped shaking. The emergency alarms became quieter. Whatever crisis had been happening seemed to be under control, at least for now. That was when Admiral Cole Seth arrived. Daeho knew this alien was important the moment it walked into the room. It was taller than the guards and wore a uniform that looked more expensive. The patterns on its clothing were more complex, and it moved with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed without question. The guards immediately tried to stand, at attention, but without their light communication they looked awkward and uncertain. The Admiral made clicking sounds that were clearly questions, but the guards had trouble answering in a way that made sense. The Admiral's large eyes moved around the room, taking in the situation. It noticed the repaired wall panel. It noticed the way the guards were now positioned in an organized formation. And it noticed Daeho standing calmly in the center of it all. More aliens entered the room behind the Admiral. These ones carried devices that looked like recording equipment. Daeho realized that word of what had happened was spreading through the ship. The aliens were curious about how 2 human prisoners had helped solve their communication crisis. Admiral Cole Seth walked directly to Daeho. It was even taller up close, and its presence felt heavy and intimidating. But Daeho had faced enemy officers before. He kept his back straight and looked directly into the Admiral's black eyes. The Admiral spoke, and this time Dae-ho heard a translation device working. The words came out in accented but understandable Korean. "You are the human who cannot speak." Dae-ho nodded once. "But you directed my guards when they could not direct themselves." Another nod. The Admiral walked in a slow circle around Dae-ho, studying him like a puzzle it was trying to solve. "My officers tell me you understand our formations better than some of our own soldiers. How is this possible for a primitive creature?" Dae-ho said nothing because he could not, but he held the Admiral's gaze steadily. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the most powerful answer of all. The Admiral stopped in front of him again. "I am told that your people communicate by making noise with your mouths, like animals barking at each other. Yet you organized my guards without making any sound at all." Dae-ho raised his hands slowly, making sure the Admiral could see he was not reaching for a weapon. Then he began to demonstrate. He pointed to his eyes, then to the Admiral's eyes. He made a gesture that showed understanding passing between them. He pointed to his hands and made simple signs that showed different emotions: respect, attention, readiness. Then he did something that surprised everyone in the room. He pointed to the Admiral's temple where the communication lights should have been flashing. He made a gesture that showed the lights working, then failing, then working again. But then he pointed to his own eyes and hands and face and made a gesture that showed these things always working. The message was clear. Your technology can fail, but natural communication never stops working. The Admiral's black eyes seemed to grow even larger. It looked at Dae-ho for a long moment without moving. Then it turned to the lead guard and made clicking sounds that were clearly questions. The guard answered, and Dae-ho could hear respect in its voice even though he could not understand the words. The guard pointed to the organized formation of its team, then to the repaired wall panel, then back to Dae-ho and Bora. Other guards joined the conversation, clicking excitedly. They were telling the Admiral about how the two humans had solved problems that the aliens could not solve themselves. Admiral Kolseth turned back to Dae-ho. This time when it spoke, its voice was different, less hostile and more curious. "You interest me, silent human. My people have conquered 100 worlds with our superior technology. We communicate faster and more efficiently than any species we have ever encountered. Yet when our systems failed, it was you who restored order." Dae-ho tilted his head slightly, waiting. "I want to understand how this is possible. My science officers will study you and your companion. We will learn what makes humans capable of such primitive yet effective coordination." The Admiral made a gesture to the guards, and they began moving the other human prisoners toward the door. But when they reached for Dae-ho and Bora, the Admiral held up a hand. "Not these two. They will come with me to the command level. I have questions that need answers." As they left the prison room, Dae-ho caught Bora's eye. She looked frightened, but he made a small gesture with his hand that meant, "Stay calm and trust me." She nodded and walked closer to him. They were no longer just prisoners. They were no longer written off as broken and useless. For the first time since the invasion of Earth, they were being treated as something valuable. But Dae-ho knew this was only the beginning. The real test would come when the aliens tried to understand that what they called primitive communication was actually something much more complex and powerful than their own technology. He could not speak, but he was about to teach an entire empire a lesson they would never forget. The lesson was simple. The most advanced communication system in the universe was the one that worked even when everything else failed. The human heart and mind working together in perfect silence. The command deck of the Valiran flagship was unlike anything Dae-ho had ever seen. The walls curved around them like the inside of a giant bubble, covered with displays that showed star maps, ship positions, and streams of data in the alien language. The air hummed with the sound of advanced technology working at full power. Admiral Kolseth stood in the center of it all, surrounded by officers who moved around him in careful patterns. But Dae-ho could see the problem immediately. Even though their communication lights were working again, the officers looked nervous and uncertain. They kept checking their displays and making the same reports over and over. Bora stayed close, To Daeho, as they were led to a raised platform where they could see everything, she whispered quietly, "Something big is happening. Look at how scared they all seem." She was right. Despite their advanced technology and superior attitudes, the Valyran officers were clearly worried about something. Their light communications flashed rapidly, but their body language showed fear and confusion. Admiral Kolseth approached them with two other high-ranking aliens. One wore the markings of a science officer, and the other looked like a military strategist. The Admiral activated a translation device so the humans could understand. "The situation has changed," Admiral Kolseth said without any introduction. "Rebel forces across 17 star systems have begun targeting our communication networks. They have learned to disrupt our bioelectric systems using weapons we did not know they possessed." The science officer stepped forward. Its voice was higher than the Admiral's when translated. "In the past week, we have lost contact with 43 ships and 12 planetary command centers. Our forces are becoming isolated from each other." The strategist made clicking sounds that sounded frustrated even before translation. "Our tactical coordination depends entirely on instant communication between all units. Without it, we cannot maintain our formations or execute complex battle plans." Admiral Kolseth looked directly at Daeho. "Which brings us to you, silent human. When our systems failed 3 days ago, you coordinated my guards using methods my people had forgotten. We need to understand how." Daeho listened carefully to everything they said. He was beginning to understand the bigger picture. The Valyran Empire had become so dependent on their advanced communication technology that they had lost the ability to work together when it failed. Now their enemies had found a way to exploit this weakness. The Admiral gestured to the busy command deck around them. "Tomorrow we face the largest rebel fleet ever assembled. Intelligence reports suggest they have weapons specifically designed to disrupt our communication networks. If they succeed, we will be fighting blind and deaf." Bora looked at Daeho with wide eyes. She understood what the Admiral was asking. These aliens wanted to learn human methods of coordination as a backup plan for when their technology failed them. Daeho nodded slowly and stepped forward. He pointed to himself, then to the Admiral, then made a gesture that meant, "Teach." The Admiral's translation device picked up the meaning. "You will show us how humans coordinate without technology?" Daeho nodded again. Then he held up one finger and pointed around the command deck. He needed to see how they normally worked before he could show them a better way. For the next hour, Daeho and Bora watched the Valyran officers go through their standard procedures. The aliens moved in rigid patterns, always waiting for light signals from their superiors before taking any action. When orders came through their communication implants, they followed them exactly without any improvisation or independent thinking. It reminded Daeho of watching robots work in a factory. Very efficient when everything worked perfectly, but completely helpless when something went wrong. He began to understand why the rebels were winning. The Valyrans fought like a machine with one brain. Cut the connections between the parts and the whole system fell apart. Humans fought differently. Each soldier was trained to think independently while still working as part of a team. When communication failed, human units could still function because every person understood the bigger picture and could make decisions on their own. Admiral Kolseth approached him again. "What have you observed?" Daeho pointed to one of the junior officers who was standing perfectly still, waiting for orders. He made a gesture that showed the officer as frozen, unable to move without permission. Then he pointed to himself and made gestures that showed thinking, deciding, and acting independently. The Admiral's black eyes followed his movements carefully. "You are saying that your people can function without constant direction from their commanders?" Daeho nodded. Then he pointed to Bora and made a series of gestures that showed the two of them working together during the crisis 3 days ago. He showed how they had shared information and made decisions together without any formal chain of command. Bora understood what he wanted her to do. She stepped forward and spoke to the Admiral. "In human military units, every soldier is trained to understand the mission goals, not just their individual tasks. If the radio fails, we can still work together because we all know what we're trying to accomplish." The science officer made excited clicking sounds. Fascinating, redundant decision-making capability distributed throughout the organizational structure. But how do you coordinate actions without central communication? Asked the strategist. This was the question Deho had been waiting for. He asked for a group of junior officers to be brought forward. 10 young Valyrans stood in a line looking nervous about being selected for whatever the strange human had planned. Deho positioned himself where all 10 could see him clearly. Then he began to teach them the first lesson in natural communication. He started with basic hand signals. Point up meant advance. Point down meant retreat. A closed fist meant stop. An open hand meant proceed with caution. Simple gestures that could be seen from a distance even in the chaos of battle. The young officers tried to copy his movements, but they looked awkward and uncertain. They kept glancing at their superiors for approval before making each gesture. Deho shook his head and pointed to his own eyes. Then he made the gestures again, but this time he added facial expressions. When he signaled advance, his face showed confidence and determination. When he signaled retreat, his expression showed tactical awareness, not fear. Bora joined the demonstration. She stood across the room from Deho and they began a conversation using only gestures and expressions. To the watching aliens, it looked like magic. The two humans were clearly sharing complex information without making any sound or using any technology. One of the young officers raised a tentative hand. Through the translation device, it asked, "How do we know what the facial expressions mean? They are not the same as our expressions." Deho smiled, which seemed to confuse the aliens even more. He pointed to the officer who had asked the question, then made a gesture that clearly meant good question. Even though the alien did not understand human smiles, it could tell from Deho's body language that its question was welcomed. Then Deho did something that surprised everyone. He began copying Valyran body language. He had been watching them for days and he had learned to recognize their postures and movements. When a Valyran was uncertain, it tilted its head slightly to the left. When it was confident, it stood with its shoulders back and its long neck straight. He demonstrated these postures to the group, showing that he had learned their natural communication signals just by watching. The young officers looked amazed. Their own body language was so automatic that they had never thought of it as a form of communication. Admiral Kolseth stepped forward. "You learned our movement patterns simply by observation?" Deho nodded. Then he pointed to all the officers on the command deck and made a sweeping gesture. Every one of them was constantly communicating through their posture, their positioning, and their movements. They just did not realize they were doing it. The Admiral looked around at its own crew as if seeing them for the first time. "We have been using natural communication all along, but we ignored it because we trusted our technology." "More," Deho nodded again. Then he made one final gesture that brought everything together. He pointed to the Admiral's temple where the communication implant was located. He showed it working, then failing, then working again. Technology was unreliable. Then he pointed to his own eyes, hands, and heart. He showed these things working steadily, never failing, always available. Natural communication was always there, ready to be used when everything else broke down. The lesson was simple but powerful. The most advanced species in the galaxy had forgotten how to use the communication system they were born with. Admiral Kolseth was quiet for a long moment. Then it made a decision that would change the course of the coming battle. "Cancel all training exercises scheduled for tomorrow," it ordered. "Every officer on the ship will spend the day learning human coordination methods. If the rebels want to take away our technology, we will show them that the Valyran Empire can adapt and survive." The Admiral looked at Deho with something that might have been gratitude. "You have given us a weapon more powerful than any in our arsenal, the ability to fight as one even when we cannot speak as one." As the command deck erupted into activity around, the rebel fleet appeared on the edge of the star system like a swarm of angry insects. Hundreds of ships of different sizes and designs, all armed with weapons meant to destroy the Valyran Empire. On the command deck, officers watched their displays with nervous energy as the enemy forces moved into attack formation. Daiho stood beside Admiral Kolseth, watching everything with calm eyes. In the past day, he had worked with dozens of Valyran officers, teaching them the basics of silent communication. Some had learned quickly, while others still struggled with the concept of working without constant technological guidance. Bora was at a nearby station, helping the engineering teams understand human methods of emergency repair. She had shown them how human technicians could fix complex problems using simple tools and creative thinking when advanced equipment was not available. "Enemy ships are powering their jamming systems," reported the tactical officer. The lights under its skin flashed rapidly as it communicated additional details to the Admiral. Admiral Kolseth nodded and activated the ship-wide communication system. Its voice echoed through every corridor and room of the massive flagship. "All crews prepare for communication disruption. Remember your training from yesterday, trust your instincts and work together." The Admiral looked at Daiho. "Are you ready to see if your methods work in real combat?" Daiho nodded once. He was as ready as he could be. But the real test would not be for him. The test would be for the thousands of Valyran officers who had spent their entire lives depending on technology to tell them what to do. The first wave of jamming hit the fleet like an invisible storm. All across the command deck, the lights under the officers' skin flickered and went dark. Communication displays showed nothing but static. The careful coordination that had held the Valyran fleet together for decades suddenly disappeared. For a moment, the command deck was completely silent, except for the hum of the ship's engines. Officers looked around at each other with wide, frightened eyes. They had trained for this moment, but training was different from reality. Then Captain Nolves stepped forward. She was the officer who had worked most closely with Daiho during the training sessions. Instead of waiting for orders that could not come, she began using the hand signals he had taught her. She pointed to the tactical display, then made a gesture that meant, "Enemy approaching." She pointed to the weapon stations and made the signal, for "Prepare to fire." Other officers saw what she was doing and began copying her actions. Slowly, like a machine coming back to life, the command deck began to function again. Officers used hand signals, eye contact, and body language to coordinate their actions. They moved with less precision than before, but they moved together as a team. Admiral Kolseth watched with amazement as its crew adapted to the crisis. It looked at Daiho and made a gesture of thanks that needed no translation. The rebel fleet launched their attack. Hundreds of enemy ships charged toward the Valyran formation, expecting to find a confused and disorganized force. Instead, they found something they had never seen before. Valyran ships moving in perfect coordination, despite having no electronic communication at all. The Valyran fleet responded like a living creature. When the lead ships adjusted their positions, the ships behind them followed smoothly. When one group of vessels moved to intercept enemy fighters, another group automatically moved to cover the gap they left behind. "How are they doing this?" Bora whispered, watching the tactical display with wonder. Daiho pointed to the bridge crew around them. The officers were communicating constantly through posture, gesture, and expression. They had learned to read each other's intentions without words or technology. More importantly, they had learned to trust each other to make good decisions independently. The battle raged for hours. The rebel fleet threw everything they had at the Valyrans, but they could not break the strange new coordination they were facing. Every time they tried to exploit what looked like a weakness in the formation, they found that the Valyran ships had already moved to counter their attack. The turning point came when a group of rebel ships managed to break through the Valyran line and threaten the flagship directly. In the old days, this would have caused panic as officers waited for specific orders from their superiors. Instead, Captain Nolves made a decision on her own. She looked at Admiral Kolseth and made a gesture that asked for permission to act. The Admiral nodded. Without any electronic communication, Nolves coordinated with the other ships around the flagship using light signals and ship positioning. The rebel attack was turned into a trap. As the enemy ships charged toward what they thought was a helpless target, Valyran vessels moved into position around them like the closing of a fist. The rebels found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. The rebel commander tried one last desperate move. He activated the most powerful jamming device in his arsenal, hoping to completely blind the Valiran fleet. The electromagnetic pulse was so strong that it knocked out backup systems and emergency communications throughout both fleets. For a few moments, space was filled with ships that could not talk to each other at all. The silence was complete and absolute. That was when Deho's lessons proved their true worth. The Valiran ships continued to move in perfect formation. Their crews had learned that the most important communication was not the words they spoke, or the signals they sent, but the understanding they shared. They knew their mission, they trusted their teammates, and they could work together even in complete silence. The rebel fleet, which had always depended on constant radio chatter and electronic coordination, fell apart. Ships collided with each other as their crews panicked. Attack formations broke down as individual captains made decisions without consulting their commanders. Within an hour, the battle was over. The rebel fleet was destroyed or scattered. The Valiran Empire had won its greatest victory in decades, and they had done it without speaking a single word through their advanced communication systems. As the cheers of victory echoed through the ship, Admiral Kulseth approached Deho with formal ceremony. In front of the entire command crew, the admiral made a gesture that Deho recognized as a military salute of the highest respect. Then the admiral did something unprecedented in Valiran history. It spoke aloud, without using any translation, to Vice, struggling with the Korean words it had learned. "Thank you, teacher." The simple words, spoken with difficulty but genuine gratitude, meant more to Deho than any grand speech could have. He had found his voice again, not through sound but through the silence that taught an empire how to listen. In the days that followed, everything changed. The Valiran Empire began training all of its forces in human coordination methods. They did not abandon their technology, but they no longer feared the silence when it failed. Deho was given quarters near the admiral's personal chambers and the title of cultural advisor. He worked with Valiran officers throughout the fleet, teaching them that true communication came from understanding, not from the tools they used to transmit messages. Bora became the head of a new engineering program that focused on simple, reliable solutions to complex problems. She taught alien engineers that sometimes the best fix was the one that used the least technology. Most importantly, the treatment of human prisoners throughout the Empire began to change. The Valirans had learned that being different did not mean being inferior. They began to see humans not as primitive creatures but as teachers who could show them forgotten truths about themselves. Deho never regained his voice, but he learned that he did not need it. In the quiet spaces between words, in the gentle movements of hands and the understanding that passed between minds, he had found a way to speak that was more powerful than any sound he could have made. He had taught an empire that sometimes the most important conversations happen in perfect silence. And in that silence, he had found not just his purpose, but his peace. The human who could not speak had given the galaxy a new way to listen. And the universe would never be the same.